Right, we've been rattling our way through these talks at a fair old rate, in the sense of averaging one talk per book, and that's been good. If we weren't doing that, we'd obviously be doing it probably for the rest of our lives, this Bible survey. But we're gonna slow the pace down tonight, just for the next 2 or 3 talks. And the reason that we're just going to slow it down is because it's starting to get a little bit complicated. And because it's starting to get a little bit complicated, therefore we want to make sure that we're taking it really slowly and aren't getting too lost. And of course I'm talking about the fact that you remember that last time, because we saw the division of the kingdom into north and south, we saw that it got to the point in the story when we were doing 1 Kings where it was jumping between north and south. So you get bits and pieces about what's happening in the south, and then it jumps up to the north, what's happening there, and then back down to the south, and it all gets a bit complicated. Now, because last time when we were doing 1 Kings it was only like that for the second half of the book, we were well able to take it all in our stride in 1 talk. However, 2 Kings, by and large, is that all the way through. So it gets a little bit complicated. So that's why, when it comes now to doing 2 Kings, we're not going to do it in 1 talk. We're going to do it in 2 talks. And we're going to begin each of those talks with a real leisurely recap on what happened in the last talk. Can you see? So that we get the continuity. And so therefore that's why tonight, although we're coming on to 2 Kings, we'll be on 2 Kings this time and next time as well. And as I say, because it's just starting to get a little bit complicated, there's going to be a lot of jumping around north and south. Okay, so we're going to start with a very leisurely recap, the story so far. I don't mean from Genesis onwards, I mean from King Saul onwards, from the fact that when we were doing Samuel, the books of Samuel, we saw that suddenly the king, that now Israel has a king. And of course it started off with King Saul, then King Saul was rejected, and then there came King David. And last time in 1 Kings, that book started with the death of King David and the rule of Solomon, who took over from him as his son. So what we've got, all right, is that last time we saw the fact that Israel, which under King Saul, which under King David and under Solomon, was 1 nation, 1 kingdom, ruled by 1 king. But what we saw last time is that occasioned by the fact that Solomon, as he grew older, fell away from the Lord and went into idolatry, that as judgment for that, the kingdom divided into 2. And you'll remember that what happened is that when Solomon died, he was succeeded by his son Rehoboam. But during the life of Solomon, there was this other character, Jeroboam, no relation, but he was the leader of Solomon's workforce. And he was told by a prophet, Ahijah in fact, that he was going to lead this confederacy of the tribes who would break away from Solomon. And so what happened was that Rehoboam, King Solomon's son, became king over 1 kingdom. But that he got off to a very bad start. Do you remember the people came to him and they said, well look, do you think we could just have a little bit more of a relaxed regime than your father gave us? And you'll remember he said, look, my father scourged with whips, but I will scourge you with scorpions, not a tactful approach. And that set the people off, and they said, oh, this is, no way, you're not getting our allegiance. And so that was when the division happened, and Jeroboam became the king of the confederacy who pulled away. All right, so we had King Saul, he was rejected, then King David, then his son King Solomon, and when Solomon died, his son took over, and it was then that this division of the nation into two separate kingdoms or nations happened. And you'll remember that we had Judah in the south, and the capital of Judah being Jerusalem. Now we've got to understand what this tribe consisted of, all right? And it actually was the tribe of Judah along with the tribe of Simeon. Now, by this time in Israel's history, Simeon was reckoned as being one tribe with Judah. Don't necessarily ask me why. I'm just informing you that it was. This was the state of play in Israel at the time. That Simeon was regarded as being one tribe with Judah. The reason being, you'll remember that Judah, when the land was allotted, Judah had the biggest portion. Massive portion. In fact, the whole of the south of the land, really. And Simeon's chunk was all within Judah's territory. So in fact, Judah's land overlapped Simeon's land. And probably, I would imagine that is the reason, a geographical one, or if you want to get really intellectual, because it's good to do that sometimes, the geopolitical one. Good word, remember that, gets you a long way in life, geopolitical, right? Politics dictated by geography. So for that reason, Simeon was considered to be one tribe in with Judah. Now, also, there was a small portion of the tribe of Benjamin who was loyal to Judah as well. And you'll remember that that Benjamin was the tribe that encompassed the London area, Jerusalem. So what happened? The south consisted of the tribe of Judah with the tribe of Simeon and a little bit of the tribe of Benjamin, i.e. some of the Benjaminites, but not all, but some were loyal to Judah. And so what happened was that Judah, with Simeon and this little bit of Benjamin, that was the amount of the people that made up the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. All right? So you've got Judah in the south, the southern kingdom, made up of the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Simeon, and a little bit of the tribe of Benjamin. But officially, Benjamin was in with the northern tribes. So up in the north, you had Israel. So the northern kingdom from now on is known as Israel, the southern kingdom Judah, because that's the biggest tribe. So in the north, and this is where the breakaway nation was, because Solomon's son, Rehoboam, was in the south. So the breakaway kingdom was the north, Israel. And the capital there became Samaria. And what happened there is that consisted of the other 10 tribes. So this explains why, and we hit this last time, didn't we? It certainly led to a few people putting a question mark over it. The fact that Judah in the south was one tribe, but the northern kingdom consisted of 10 tribes. That doesn't make sense, does it? But now I've explained to you that the south was Judah plus Simeon, all right? The north were the other 10 tribes, all right? Remember, the tribe of Levi has no inheritance, so they don't count in this. The Levites, as the priests and the priestly assistants, they were in the north and the south. They were the common thread that linked the two kingdoms. So you've got to knock Levi out, but remember Joseph was never actually a tribe on his own. Joseph became two tribes via his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. So we've got in the south, we've got the King David, King Solomon and Rehoboam and their descendants. In the south, the Messianic line, okay. Judah with Simeon and allegiance with some of the Benjaminites. And in the north, the breakaway kingdom, Israel, the other 10 tribes. And as we're going to eventually see, that these eventually became what is still known today as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Because in actual fact they vanished from history at a certain point. And we'll see, I think it will be the next talk we do, how that came to actually be. And so that's where we got to last time, the division of the kingdom. We saw the death of King David, and you remember that rather cute thing about, you know, that girl Abishag, who was this hot water bottle. She was so old and couldn't stay warm at night. It was rather sweet, wasn't it? And we saw his death. We saw Solomon taking over. We saw the reign of Solomon. That took up a great deal of 1 Kings. Then his falling away and this judgment coming on him, and with this division of the kingdom. So then, now we've got to recap the history that we saw last time from Solomon onwards, and how that breaks down after the division of the north and the south. So we'll just kind of refresh our memories. This is all what we covered last time, so that when we come on in a few minutes to do 2 Kings, we're seeing the connection, you know, the way that it all connects. Because in effect, 2 Kings is just 1 King's carried on. You know, I mean, obviously the writer decided, I'll end it here, and then I'll write a book 2. All right. So then, we've had King Saul, King David, King Solomon. Thus far, kings over the whole land. All right. Solomon dies and is succeeded by his heir, his son Rehoboam. All right. Now then, it is in his lifetime that this division occurs. So we now have Rehoboam as the king in the south, Judah, plus the tribe of Simeon, plus a little bit of Benjamin. All right. So he is now the king in the southern kingdom. The breakaway kingdom decided that they would have Jeroboam as their king. So we've got Rehoboam, Solomon's son, in the south. We've got Jeroboam, the first of the kings of the northern kingdom, Israel. And we'll just remind ourselves of the history of the south first. So we've got Rehoboam, Solomon's son, reigning in the south. And I suppose had he been even more cloudy, he could have reigned in the north as well. Oh dear. It's been a bad day. No, it's been a good day, but it's been a distracting day. So if my humour is a little bit off tonight, that's why, right? Now, so Rehoboam, some would say, no, that's not off, that's normal. Right, so Rehoboam ruling in the south. Now, we saw that he was into idolatry. Remember, his father, Solomon, had backslidden in his later years. Rehoboam was idolatrous, so he was into idols, blah, blah, blah. And remember, we saw that during his reign, the south, Judah, was attacked by Egypt. Not invaded, but attacked. A raiding party, the Egyptian army, came in on a raid, and they stripped the temple. So that was how far this raid went. They got into Jerusalem, they got into the temple, and they stripped the temple. And of course, what they stripped it off was all the stuff made of gold, which was most of the inside of the temple. And they had it away on their toes with all the gold. And after Israel recovered from that attack, Rehoboam could only replace the gold with bronze. So in one generation from Solomon, who was the richest man in the world, we saw that last time, didn't we? So under Solomon, Israel was the richest nation on the earth and as rich as they could possibly be. Now, one generation later, because Solomon fell away and his son is into idolatry as well, one generation later, that which was gold and has now been nicked by the Egyptians could only be refurbished in bronze. You see, the blessing of God has gone. And Rehoboam reigned for 17 years, and he was 41 when he started to reign. And he was succeeded by his son Abijah. So Rehoboam dies, and his son Abijah, Solomon's grandson, King David's great-grandson, now takes over. And Abijah became king in the 18th year of Jeroboam's reign in Israel. Now that gets complicated, but that is how, going through these books, we can get all the dates that we need. You see what I mean? Because we know at what point in one kingdom's king's reign, we know at what point another king reigned in the other kingdom. So this is how we get a very accurate chronology. And Ahijah reigned for 3 years. He was evil, he was into idolatry, he reigned over Judah for 3 years. And he was succeeded by his son, who was called Asa. And then we went on to see that Asa, he reigned for 41 years in Judah, and he followed the Lord. He was a good king. And we saw that during his reign, he was attacked by Israel, the northern kingdom, when they had a king called Baasha, B-A-A-S-H-A, or Baasha, because Baasha was a bit of a basher. When you read about Baasha, that's what he did, bash, bash, bash. Easy for Christians to be like that sometimes, isn't it? Yeah, but Baasha was bash, bash, bash. And Baasha had a bash at Israel during the reign of Asa. And you know, sort of, he got into an alliance with Aram, or Syria. So you had the northern kingdom under the reign of Baasha in alliance with the king of Aram, and getting together with the king of Aram and attacking Asa. Now Asa was a goodie in the south, Baasha was a baddie. Baasha, right, in the north. Now, Baasha lost the fight, alright, and Asa succeeded in breaking the alliance that Baasha had with the king of Aram. So the point is, in the reign of Asa, Baasha attacks in alliance with Aram, but King Asa gets the victory and breaks the alliance that the north had with Aram or Syria. So, you know, victory there for King Asa. And, I mean, obviously loads of other things happened in his 41-year rule, but we're not told that much. I'm just going over what the Bible actually tells us. And then he died, and he was succeeded by his son, Jehoshaphat. And Jehoshaphat, he reigned in Judah for 25 years. He was 35 when he became king, and he was a believer, like his father Asa. He was a good king, and you'll remember we saw that he got into an alliance with King Ahab, another bad king in the north. Well, we'll come on to the kings in the north in a minute, just to refresh your memory about them. Remember that Jehoshaphat, although he was a good king, he had a bit of a weakness. He made alliances with some very undesirable people, and he made an alliance with King Ahab, the baddie king in the north, and to get Ramoth Gilead back from Aram, because Aram or Syria caused all sorts of problems for them at this time. And so, you know, sort of like Jehoshaphat got into an alliance with Ahab to go and get Ramoth Gilead back from Aram, or from Syria, who had invaded it. And, you know, so that's what we're told about him. And you remember that we saw just quickly that he was succeeded by his son called Jehoram. And what happened was that when he was succeeded by his son, he ended up in what was called a co-regency, you know, for some years. This was quite common in the ancient world. If you had a reigning king who suddenly died, heart attack, or killed in battle, or, you know, something like that, sudden death, they're succeeded by their son there and then. But often what would happen, that, you know, if a king was getting fairly old and, you know, I mean, sort of, you know, he hadn't been killed or something, and he knew that his son was going to take over, what they do is that the son would become king and they'd share a co-regency together. So they were like both king, but you had the dad, who was like the senior king, and the son, who was like the king in training. And they worked like that for a few years until the son took over completely. So, you know, we saw that last time. Now, let's go down what was happening in the north now, in Israel. And this is, remember all what we saw last time in 1 Kings. So just refreshing our memory so that when we move on now to 2 Kings, that we've got that continuity. Now then, of course, up in the north, we have old Jeroboam. Now remember, Jeroboam, he was the head of Solomon's workforce. So he was an important official in Solomon's kingdom. And you'll remember that Ahijah, the prophet, went to him and told him that he was going to lead this breaking away of 10 nations, which would be a judgment against Solomon because of his idolatry. And you'll remember when Solomon found out about this, that he tried to kill him, but Jeroboam escaped. And then what happened when Solomon eventually died? His son Rehoboam got on the throne. The people, with Jeroboam as kind of their spokesman, right, went to him and said, look, can we, you know, have this more relaxed regime than we had with your dad? And remember, he said, oh no, my dad's scourged with whips, I'll scourge with sky, it's going to get worse. And that was when they said, right, we're finished with you. And that was when the northern kingdom, Israel, came into being, the 10 tribes, and they went up north and they made Jeroboam their king. So now Jeroboam, the king in the north. And you remember that, you know, I said one might have been, you know, sort of like forgiven for thinking he was a bit of a goodie. But we saw that once he was enthroned as king, obviously his people were still going down to Jerusalem to worship. And he thought, oh no, if they do that, they'll switch their allegiance back to the south. And so we saw that what he did is he created his own religion, didn't he? He got like a mixture, a bit of the Lord, and he had these 2 golden calves, one at the north end of his kingdom and one at the south end, so that wherever his people were, they could get to one of these calves for worship. So he actually created his own kind of idolatrous religion to try and keep his people loyal to him. And as a result of that, remember, judgment was prophesied against him. And you know, remember the prophet who came up and you know, spoke about, you know, God's judgment. He held his hand out, didn't he? And his hand became leprous and stayed leprous until the prophet prayed for him. And you know, that prophet told him that this religion that he had created would one day be destroyed by a king who would come from Judah, from the south, called Josiah. And that was many years hence, but we will eventually see how that prophecy was fulfilled. And you'll remember that his son Abijah died, and well, you know, he got ill, and his wife went to Ahijah, the prophet, who was the one who told him that he was going to be the king in the north in the first place. His wife went disguised to Ahijah, the prophet, to find out whether his son Abijah was going to live or not. And the prophet knew who she was, even though he was blind, was expecting her. And he says, you know, you go and tell your husband that, you know, your son's going to die and that all your descendants are going to be completely cut off because of this idolatry that you're doing in the north. And so there's a prophecy that Jeroboam is going to be all his descendants completely cut off, so that none of his descendants would remain alive to carry on the throne. And by the time his wife got back to Jeroboam, their son died. And so Jeroboam there in the north, and he reigned for 22 years. And when he died, he was succeeded by his son Nadab, who was obviously the brother of Abijah, who had died. And this Nadab reigned for 2 years, we saw. And again, he was evil, just like his dad, idolatry, bad king, blah, blah, blah. And he was assassinated by Baasha. Right? Remember Baasha? He's all bashing, isn't we? Well, Baasha starts bashing here. And Baasha didn't only assassinate Nadab. But he then went on and killed the entire royal family. He murdered the whole lot, thus fulfilling the prophecy of Ahijah the prophet, that Jeroboam's descendants will be completely cut off because of his idolatry. So now, a generation later, Jeroboam's son is reigning. He's assassinated by Baasha, who then assassinates the rest of his family. So now Jeroboam's descendants are completely cut off, thus fulfilling Ahijah's prophecy. So now Baasha takes over and he reigns. This is all in the north in Israel for 24 years. And again, like, he was baddie, naughty boy. Did the alliance thing, didn't he, with Aram, and then attacked the south. It's funny, the south had been left alone by the north, but now Asa is a good king. And so suddenly, this bad king in the north decides to attack the south. That's interesting, isn't it? The south had been relatively left alone because of, when all the kings were bad. But when Asa comes along, he's king in the south, a believer, suddenly the north, and they're all bad. They want to attack. That's interesting, isn't it? Satan attacking what God was doing down in the south. So, sort of like he gets into that alliance with Aram and attacks Asa down in Judah. And as a result of that, a prophet, Jehu, comes onto the scene and prophesies to him that he was going to be judged, that he would die, and that his descendants would be cut off as well, as judgment against all his sin. So Baasha dies, and he's succeeded by his son Elah. Now Elah reigns for 2 years and was murdered while he was drunk. So got drunk and he was assassinated. Kings who get drunk are asking for trouble. You're not exactly on your guard when you're drunk. Well, he got drunk and he was assassinated by a bloke called Zimri. And Zimri didn't just kill Elah, he went on and killed his whole family. So now Baasha's descendants are all cut off, just as the prophet Jehu has said they would be. So now Zimri, he becomes king, all right? And he lasted a week, right? He reigned for a whole week, 7 whole days. Wow, what a kingdom. And he was murdered by the army, because obviously the north had their own army, just as Judah did in the south. The army murdered him, and they installed Omri, who was their commander, as the king. So you had a military coup there. Now the military step in. This is ridiculous. One assassination after another. So we're going to assassinate you and bring an end to all the assassinations. You see, that's obviously often how military coups work, don't they? So Omri, the commander of the army, is installed as king, having murdered, the army having murdered Zimri. And he's then challenged by a guy called Tibni, who thought that he'd make a good king. So Tibni is dispatched, he's killed. So he was a contender for the throne, but Tibni never actually became a king, all right? So we've got Omri, the commander of the army, now king, and he reigns for 12 years. And when he died, he was succeeded by his son Ahab. Right? Now Ahab, and we're getting very much now to where we came to the end of 1 Kings, Ahab, the Bible said, was Israel's worst king yet. So having looked at all the kings that went before, Ahab was the worst one yet. So Israel is in a bit of a state. And you'll remember he married Jezebel, and Jezebel was the daughter of Ethbaal, who was the king of Sidon. Sidon was a major centre for Baal worship, hence the name of her father, the king Ethbaal, right? So now Ahab, having married the high priestess of Baal worship now becomes a major contender in Israel for the hearts of the people. So now you've got Baal worship and worship of the Lord going on side by side, and the people are doing a little bit of one and a little bit of the other. They've got a dippy into this and a dippy into that. It wasn't that they were completely Baal or completely the Lord. They were mixing the two.
And you'll remember that that was when Elijah stepped in on the scene. And Ahab was dealt with through him. And you remember Elijah, there's the drought as judgment on Israel for the idolatry of Baal worship. And then eventually Elijah challenges them to the contest on Mount Carmel, you know, the God who answers by fire. You've got the prophets of Baal there, and you've got Elijah there. And he does this thing to the people, look, you know, how long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. And, you know, it's what Elijah said, look, it's make your mind up time. And obviously he calls down the fire from heaven, and the prophets of Baal can't. And so he exposes Baal for what he was, a no God, you know, nothing, you know, just a demonic deception. And so, you know, very much through the ministry of Elijah, you know, Ahab got sort of dealt with. And then we saw when we were doing Jehoshaphat that Ahab ended up forming an alliance with Jehoshaphat against Aram, Syria. It was called Aram then, but Syria later. And he got into that alliance so that they could attack Syria and get Ramoth Gilead back from them. And as a result of that battle, Ahab died. So it was in that battle that Ahab died, and having reigned for 22 years. And he was then succeeded by his son Ahaziah. And so that brought us to where we were last week. That brought us to the end of 1 Kings. And at the end of 1 Kings last time, we were halfway through the ministry of Elijah. That's where, you know, Jehoshaphat in the south had, you know, come on the scene, but sort of like, you know, 1 Kings didn't home in too much on him, and but mainly on Ahab. And we were halfway through the ministry of Elijah up in Israel in the northern kingdom. And you'll remember that he had just anointed Elisha to succeed him, and then Ahab dies in the battle against Aram for Ramoth Gilead. So where we come to, we're halfway through the ministry of Elijah. Elijah has just anointed Elisha to take over from him when he's taken up to heaven. Ahab has died in the battle with Aram to get Ramoth Gilead back. So Ahab is dead, and his son takes over. And Jehoshaphat, the good king in the south, Ahab has been in alliance with him. Jehoshaphat is still going strong in the south and moves into a co-regency with his son Jehoram. So that's where we were last time, and the date is now around 850 BC. King David was 1000 BC, now the date is like 850 BC. So that's where we ended last time, and now we move into 2 Kings, where it just carries on. So it's, you know, I mean, you know, try and forget it was 1 Kings, and this is just net. We just carry on as if we weren't in a new book at all. We carry on with that history that we've just seen. So we're going to meander through it at a very leisurely pace, because again we're going to have to do lots of jumping between back in the south and then meanwhile back at the ranch. It's going to be all that sort of stuff, jumping to and fro from the north and south, and there are times when the north and the south are working together, and it complicates it, so we'll take it very, very slowly. Therefore, chapter 1. No, I don't mean like that. I just mean that we're just going to, you know, like meander. So now we're on 2 Kings and chapter 1. That's not bad. We're halfway through, and that's just the introduction. Right, okay. Chapter 1, we're in the northern kingdom still. We're still in Israel, and Ahab's son, Ahaziah, is the king. So this is, we can see, it's very much the ministry of Elijah carrying on. Ahab has died in the battle at the end of 1 Kings. So here, his son, Ahaziah, has taken over as the king of Israel, the northern kingdom. And, oh, excuse me, sharp intake of breath. Right, so Ahaziah falls through the roof. It's one way to start a book off, isn't it? But that is how the book starts. Ahaziah, Ahab's son, king of Israel, up in the north, he falls through the roof and he hurts himself. So he's in a state. He sustains bad injuries. And what he does is that he sends a deputation of his men to inquire of occultists who worshipped the god Baal-zebub. You remember in an earlier talk we saw how that name eventually came to form, the name that the Jews used for Satan, Lord of the Flies. But anyway, he sends off a group of people to inquire whether or not he would recover from his injuries. So what happens here, he's fallen through a roof, he's hurt himself badly, and he is now indulging in occult healing. Now what happens is the messengers who he sent off to inquire of this god Baal-zebub, alright, the messengers who are on this errand are intercepted by Elijah, who sends them back to Ahaziah with the pronouncement that he would die, that because he turned to occultism and not the Lord, that he would die, that these injuries would lead to his death. And so Ahaziah doesn't like this. He gets a bit miffed that Elijah should have dared to have made this pronouncement to him. Now you'd have thought that he'd learned his lesson. I mean, everything his father went through with Elijah, but people like this are slow to learn lessons. I mean, the whole of the book of Proverbs really is saying that the fool doesn't learn his lesson, but the wise man does. And so what Ahaziah does, he dispatches a company of 50 soldiers, like a little battalion of 50 soldiers, to bring Elijah to him. So these band of 50 soldiers, they're off to find Elijah, ordering Elijah, come before Ahaziah, Elijah having proclaimed the word of the Lord to him. And so they find him, and the captain of these men orders him to go with them to the king. So they're consumed by fire. Elijah calls fire down from heaven on them. And so Ahaziah finds out what has happened, that his band of soldiers have been consumed by fire. A fiery personality did Elijah. It was sort of like his speciality, calling fire down from heaven. And a second group of 50 soldiers are sent, and exactly the same thing happens. And it probably doesn't make any odds, because if they'd have gone back without him, Ahaziah would have fired them anyway. So the same thing happens to them. They're consumed by fire. And Ahaziah finds out what happens and dispatches a third battalion of 50 soldiers. Now, this third battalion has a wise man for their captain. And he gets down on his knees in front of Elijah, because he doesn't want to be consumed by it. He knows exactly what's going to happen. If you mess with Elijah, if you mess with the Lord, all right, under these circumstances, and he knows exactly, and so he gets down on his knees and he begs Elijah. This is Elijah. The other two captains have said, "Oi, go to the king," all right, and whoosh, all right. This one, he gets down on his knees and he says, "Pretty please," and I don't blame him, because I would have done that as well. Only I'd have been cleaning his sandals at the same time. You see what I mean? And so Elijah says, "Right, okay, fair enough, I'll come with you." That's the right attitude. I mean, not that Elijah was wanting them to crawl to him, but now some respect was being shown for the God that he represented. So now Elijah does go to Ahaziah, and as soon as he gets there, pronounces the death sentence on him personally, which probably wasn't what Ahaziah wanted to hear at all. But very soon after, Ahaziah died, and which is the story of most of the kings who fought against the Lord in such a blatant way. And we saw last time that Ahaziah ruled for 2 years. So after a 2-year reign, he comes up against Elijah, he pushes his luck, and now he's a dead man. Now, he didn't have any sons, and so therefore he couldn't be succeeded by his son, but he was succeeded as king by his younger brother Joram. Okay, now we're going to see later that Jehoshaphat's son down in the south was called Jehoram. See what I mean? It gets complicated, so don't mix them up. Right? Ahaziah is succeeded by his brother Joram because he didn't have any sons. All right. So that's the position in the north. Now in chapter 2, we come to the bit where Elijah is about to be taken up to heaven. And you remember that he strikes the Jordan and it parts, and he and Elisha go across. And Elisha requests a double portion of his spirit. And what Elijah says, so he says, look, if you see me when I'm actually taken up to heaven, then your request will be granted. You know, it's a hard thing you've asked, though. I mean, not hard for God, but hard with it for him. Because if you're filled with the Holy Spirit, that's hard. It means tribulation, it means persecution, it means submission to the Lord. And but he sees Elijah being taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire and a whirlwind. And then he tears his own clothes, and he puts on Elijah's mantle, you know, a picture of not his own strength, but, you know, the Lord's strength. And you remember he goes back across the Jordan, and he throws the mantle. He says, where is the God of Elijah? And of course the Jordan opens for him, just as it had done for Elisha. You know, Elijah, of course, a picture of being baptized with the Spirit and doing the same things that Jesus did, as he said that his disciples would. And what he does is that he kind of then the prophets, Elijah had established like a school of prophets, and these prophets then want to go and get Elijah's body because they just think Elijah's dead, and Elisha says no, don't bother, because he's actually been taken bodily into heaven, and they don't believe him. They go and look for the body, blah 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 blah. And then what happens is that now Elisha starts his actual ministry. And the first thing he does is that Jericho, he goes there, and the waters of Jericho, the water system that feeds Jericho, had become poisoned, so that the people couldn't any longer be drinking the water there. And of course, for a city, for its water supply to be poisoned, I mean, is, you know, the end of that city. Now, we saw last time, didn't we? It was in the days of Ahab, in Ahab's time, just a few years earlier, that Jericho had been rebuilt. And in the time of Joshua, when Israel came into the Promised Land, Jericho was the first city they took. And a curse was pronounced about, you know, against anyone who rebuilt Jericho. And a guy called Hiel did in the days of Ahab. And he was judged by God for it. So what we've got here is that one thing we do know is that Jericho should never have been built. It wasn't God's will at all. But it was built, it was in trouble, and so through Elisha, God blesses it. Now, that's Romans 8:28, isn't it? I mean, we spend half our lives out of God's will, don't we? It's just as well, you know, that Romans 8:28 is actually there, that all things work together for good. And here, Jericho gets blessed by the Lord. And so we've got, you know, sort of like the principle here that, you know, that even if there's something that isn't God's will, I mean, you know, sort of like some people who climb mountains, that if you say, well, why did you climb that mountain? They say, well, because it was there. And if you say, well, look, God, but why did you bless Jericho? And he says, well, because it was there. If it's there, I'll bless it. And of course, what happens was that the waters were bitter, were poisoned, and Elisha threw salt in them. And then, after he threw salt in them, they were okay. And of course, salt is a picture in the Old Testament of Jesus. And so there's a nice little, you know, sort of like picture there, as it were. And after he's done that, you know, sort of like Elisha, he's then on the way to Bethel. So he's leaving Jericho and goes to Bethel. And a whole load of youths are there, and they mock him for being bald. They call him, you know, sort of like, they go up, you bald head. So they're hurling insults at him. And, you know, so I mean, from this we can probably deduce that he was indeed bald. And as a result of this, you must understand that they were here cursing a prophet. What happens is Elisha now curses them in the name of the Lord, and two bears appear and maul 42 of these youths. And so I mean, I suppose it was Elisha's way of sort of saying, look, don't take the mick because I can't bear it. But that's what happened, So I mean, be kind of what's the lesson we're learning? Be nice to prophets, I think. Yes, right. Okay, right now chapter 3, and Joram, all right, has succeeded his brother Ahaziah, all right. So Joram is still the son of Ahab. Ahab's son Ahaziah is dead, and Ahaziah's brother Joram has taken over as king. And he wasn't as bad as his dad, but he was still pretty awful. So he's not quite as bad as Ahab, but nevertheless he wasn't very good. And at this point, Moab, which as a nation was in subjection to Israel, now rebels. So Israel controlled Moab. Now Moab does a rebellion, like fighting for its independence. And so Joram responds to this by, just like his father Ahab had done in similar circumstances with Ramoth Gilead, he gets into alliance with Jehoshaphat. So Jehoshaphat, who's still reigning in the south, or is in co-regency with his son, he comes on the scene as well now. So Joram goes down to the south and says to Jehoshaphat, come in alliance with me so we can go and beat up Moab and put them back in their place. And he agrees, But Jehoshaphat does say, as he had done once with Ahab, and then when Micaiah was pulled out of the dungeons, he said, look, is there a prophet around we can inquire of? And Elisha turns up, and what he says is he says, look, I'm going to cooperate, but only because Jehoshaphat is in this alliance. So in effect, Elisha says, look, Joram, you're out of fellowship, but Jehoshaphat isn't. So this venture is going to be blessed because of Jehoshaphat. So you're going to have victory over Moab because of Jehoshaphat. And what's happened is that at this point, Joram and Jehoshaphat are marching with their coalition army, the army of the south and the north together, and they've run out of water, so they're in a bit of a pickle now. And Elisha tells them to dig ditches, and says, if you dig these ditches, they will miraculously fill with water, and the Lord will give you all the water that you need, and that the Lord will give you a victory over Moab. And so they dig the ditches, all these ditches all around where they're camped. And then the next morning, when they got up, all these ditches were full of water. So the Lord provided them with the water that they needed it, and all the men and all the animals drank. Now, what happened in the Moabite camp is that the Moabites, they woke up in the morning and they looked on where Israel was camped. And as they looked on it, the fact that the sun was glinting on all these ditches filled with water made the water look red. And the Moabites thought that the ditches were full of blood. And so the Moabites thought, what's happened is that they've had the alliance together, they've fallen out, and they've slaughtered each other. So they've been fighting with each other, let's go in and finish them off. And so the Moabite army go down into Israel and Judah's camp, thinking that Israel and Judah have killed each other. And when they get there, they realise too late that both the armies are still there, and because Israel and Judah now had surprise on their side, the Moabite army is completely routed, and therefore the rebellion was over. And then, as he flees, the Moabite king, a bloke called Mesha, offered his son as a human sacrifice, hoping that his God would bring them victory at the last minute. But I mean, it didn't happen at all. And in light of all the water, I suppose what you call a last-ditch attempt, And anyway, then we move on to chapter 4. And Elisha has taken over this school of prophets that Elijah founded, and he's like in charge of it. And one of these prophets had died and left a widow. And this widow comes to Elijah with the sad story that because her husband had died and her creditors were coming to take her 2 boys away as slaves to pay off her debts. And the only thing she's got is a little oil in a jar. And so Elisha tells her to gather as many empty jars as possible from all her neighbours, and she does this. And then what she did with the little bit of oil she had, she was able to fill all these jars up with oil. And then Elisha said to her, right, okay, go and sell all your excess bottles of oil, and then you can pay your debts off and live off of the money you've got left. And so that's what happened, just a bit of and of course very reminiscent. You'll find that Elisha, his miracles, very similar to the kind of stuff that Elijah had done a few years earlier. And then there was a Shunammite couple who were Gentiles, but they lived in the land, and Elisha became friends with them. And what they did is that they set a room up so that Elisha and his servant called Gehazi, Elisha had a servant called Gehazi, could stay there whenever they wanted to. And Elisha eventually, because they become such good friends, says, is there anything I can do to repay your kindness? And what they said is that the wife was barren and that they wanted children, and so obviously the wife had children. And then a few years later, the boy dies, and the wife dashes off to find Elisha and tells them the bad news rather. And Elisha sends Gehazi to go straight to their house and to lay his staff on the boy's face. And so Gehazi does this, but nothing happens, and we'll see why later. And but when Elisha arrived, Elisha brought the child back to life, kind of laid on top of him twice, and then the boy sneezed 7 times and came back to life. And again, very similar to the miracle of the raising from the dead that Elijah had done as well. And then Elisha goes off to Gilgal for a meeting with his school of prophets that he runs, and there was a stew that was served up which was poisonous, and they all got stomach cramps and realised that there was they cried out, there's death in the pot. And so what Elisha does is he puts flour in it, and then they could all eat it and it was no problem. So similar to when he healed the waters of Jericho. And of course flour, meal, the meal offering, again a picture of Jesus, and you've got all this symbolism there which I haven't got time to go into. And he then feeds 100 people with 20 tiny little loaves of barley bread with plenty left over. So God does that sort of thing. Right, chapter 5. The commander of the Aramean army was a guy called Naaman. He was a good soldier in charge of the army, but he was a leper, and his wife had a Jewish girl who lived in the house with them, like as a maid. And this Jewish girl told her all about the ministry of Elisha, this prophet back home in her homeland and that. And so Naaman asked permission from his king if he could go and search this Elisha out. And the king, no problem. So the king, the Aramean king, writes a letter of reference to Joram. Remember Joram, the king in the north who took over from his brother Ahaziah, Ahab's son, all right, he's still the king in the north. And so the king of Aram sends a letter to Joram saying, I'm sending Naaman, my commander, so that he can be healed. Now then, Joram, well, healing wasn't his strong point, old Joram, you see. And when he gets a letter from the king of Aram saying about this, he freaks out thinking it's a trick for an invasion. So he gets ready for an invasion. So he thought, why is this king writing to me about healing? I don't know anything about healing. He wasn't very spiritual, you see. It's hardly his speciality. And but then Elisha explains to Joram, because Elisha knew the king. Elisha explained it all to him, and then Elisha sends a message to Naaman telling him to bathe himself 7 times in the river Jordan, and that he would therefore be healed of his leprosy. And this made Naaman angry, and on 2 counts. Firstly, Elisha didn't go to him personally, and Naaman thought that was a bit rude. And secondly, he considered Aramean or Syrian rivers to be far superior to a Jewish one, the Jordan. The nations thought the Jordan was an unclean river, because of their basic anti-Semitism and that. And so Naaman storms off in a rage. But his servants, who respect him, talk him round, and they say to him, look, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? So that puts Naaman in his place a bit. Because obviously you can't earn a thing from the Lord. You take it as a free gift, or that's you don't earn it. So he does as Elisha says. He humbles himself. He goes and bathes 7 times in the Jordan, and he's healed. And he tries to give Elisha money, but Elisha won't accept it. And Naaman has become a believer. He's become a Christian. And now what happens now, and this I think is the clue to why Gehazi wasn't used to raise the boy from the dead, all right? Gehazi goes after Naaman, and he lies to him to get money. And he tells Naaman that Elisha had sent him, which he hadn't, and that Elisha had had guests turn up unexpectedly, and could he have some provisions for his guests and that. And so Naaman, having been taken in, not realising that Gehazi is lying, sort of like, gives him all he wants. And so, Gehazi takes the loot to his own house. But the next time that he sees Elisha knows exactly what he's done, because the Lord's shown him, and he pronounces that the leprosy of Naaman would cling to Gehazi, which it does, and Gehazi became a leper, and that was judgment on him. And just notice that we've got raisings from the dead, and we've got leprosy healed, but it's all happening to Gentiles. The Shunammite couple, their son, they were Gentiles. Naaman is a Gentile. And you remember when Jesus was preaching in Nazareth, he raised this and said, in the time of Elijah and Elisha, blah, 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 that sort of, that widows received their dead back to life, and, sort of like Naaman was healed. And the people got angry and threw him out of the temple. And the reason was, because what Jesus was saying is that, can't you see you're out of fellowship? The fact that these blessings happened amongst the Gentiles and not the Jews was because Israel was out of fellowship at that time, wasn't it? And they all knew that it was. And it was Jesus saying we're out of fellowship, and that's why they got angry. So it was Jesus using the Old Testament to, illustrate to them that at his time as well, they were out of fellowship with the Lord. Anyway, chapter 6, and the school of prophets are building now. They're building a school, a permanent place of residence, and Elisha is kind of like overseeing the work and that. And one of these prophets who's working on the thing, he borrowed an axe, and as he's working, presumably chopping wood or something, the axe head flies off and lands in the Jordan, and he gets all upset because it's borrowed, and he goes to Elisha and says, I've borrowed this axe head and this axe, and I'll blah blah blah, you see, having a bit of a tiz-was. And so Elisha, he gets a stick and he throws it into the Jordan where the axe head fell in, and it floated to the top. So he got the axe head back. Well, the Lord can do things like that, can't he? Then you get a war between Aram and Israel, and so Aram against Syria attacks Israel. And every time they did so, Elisha, all right, was informing Joram, the king, that Syria, Aram was going to attack. So every time Aram attacked, the army was waiting there, all right. So, because Elisha, the Lord's telling Elisha, Aram's going to attack here. So Elisha goes to Joram and he says, get the army there because Aram's going to attack, blah, blah, blah. And so eventually the Aramean king thinks that he's got a spy in the camp. He gets all his generals together. And they say, no, it's Elijah. He's a prophet. And said he tells the king of Israel the words you speak in your bedroom. That's how they know. And so he says, right, go and get Elisha. Now, Elisha was in Dothan, and so this large section of the army is sent to Dothan, where Elisha was. And Gehazi has been replaced by another servant to Elisha, a young man. And he gets up in the morning, and he looks out, and the Aramean army surrounding Dothan. And he knows exactly why they've come. They've come to get Elisha, and they're going to get me as well. And he freaks out a bit. And he goes and tells Elisha. And Elisha says to him, look, those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And then he said, Lord, open his eyes. And suddenly, his young servant looks again, and he can still see the Aramean army surrounding Dothan. But then he sees the angelic army surrounding the Arameans. And you think, oh yeah, that's right. It's, those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And he sees that angelic army. And then the Arameans are struck by blindness. Elisha prays, Lord, will strike them blind. And he strikes them blind. And so, having got the whole army blinded, he leads them to Samaria, which was the capital, and their sight was restored. And then, to make the humbling utterly complete, they feed the army a really good meal and then send them home to Aram. And, so Aram learns its lesson. And then sometime later, Aram, the king was a guy called Ben-Hadad, he struck again. He came back again and he besieged Samaria. And this siege lasted long enough for hunger to become a problem in Samaria, and eventually cannibalism broke out. And Joram, the king, blames Elisha for this, which is a daft thing to do. But he blames Elisha, the prophet, for this. And he summons Elisha from his house in the city to the king. And then in chapter 7, Elisha goes before the king and he says, "Look, this is going to end the next day. This crisis is going to be over tomorrow. Thus saith the Lord." And one of the king's aides expressed doubt, said, "No, don't believe it. It's not going to happen." Now then, outside the city there were 4 lepers, because obviously lepers in Israel weren't allowed in the cities. And these 4 lepers decided that they had nothing to lose by going to the Aramean camp and throwing themselves on their mercy. So, so these 4 lepers, you've got the city, you've got them, and you've got the Aramean army. And they think, "Oh, blow it, we might as well go and see how our luck does with the Aramean army, throw ourselves on their mercy, they might be good to us." And they got there and they found the camp absolutely deserted. And the reason that this had happened is because the Lord had caused the Arameans to hear this mighty army coming to get them, and they fled in terror. So the 4 lepers go to the Aramean camp, who are besieging Samaria, the capital of Israel, and they find that it's gone. The army has just gone. And, they kind of eat, drink and make merry. Because obviously they dive in and they hadn't eaten and drunk so well for months. And so they're having a whale of the time. Until they think, now hang on a sec, we better go into Samaria and tell them what's happened. The siege is over, that the army's gone. And so they do that. And so Joram sends out a group of men for a reconnoitre to see if this is really true. And when it's, that it's not, that these lepers weren't spies for Aram trying to, work a trick on them. And of course they, then discover that absolutely true. The Aramean army is gone. The siege is over. And the king's aide, who expressed doubts the day before, is then trampled to death in the rush of everyone to get to the Aramean camp to get something to eat. So there was judgment on him for expressing his doubts that the Lord wouldn't deliver them. And then in chapter 8, Elisha is told by the Lord that there's going to be a famine for 7 years, and so he sends the Shunammite family, who he had befriended, into Philistine territory where they'd be okay. And that's interesting, because there's the Lord warning the Gentiles, well, okay, just leave for a while because you'll be better off down there because there's a drought coming, because Israel's out of fellowship. And, so that was kind of, again, God blessing the Gentiles because Israel out of fellowship. And then Ben-Hadad, who's the king of Israel, who had besieged Samaria, he becomes ill. And he sends an aide, a guy called Hazael, to ask Elisha if Ben-Hadad would recover. Because even though, these kings often, although they were Gentiles, they knew that the prophets of Israel were genuine prophets. Now, do you remember that God had told Elijah to ensure that Hazael was anointed king of Aram? Now, what happens is, Elisha tells this guy Hazael that his master, his king, wasn't going to recover. And, but tells him to actually lie to the king and tell him to the contrary. And say, no, the Lord says that you're going to recover. And Elisha tells him, this guy Hazael, that he's going to be the king of Aram in the place of Ben-Hadad, because that's God's will. But he weeps because this guy Hazael is being made king of Aram by God in order to oppress Israel, because Israel is so out of fellowship with the Lord. And so now Hazael is anointed as king of Aram, as the Lord had spoken to Elijah years earlier. And the next day, Hazael murders Ben-Hadad, and he then becomes the king. So Hazael is now king of Aram, just as the Lord has said to Elijah years before. Right, at this point, we switch down south. So we leave the north. Now we go down south, all right?
And we go down south to old Jehoram. Now remember Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat had been in co-regency with his son Jehoram. Okay, now Jehoram is king on his own. All right, and he does evil. He's not like Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat was a good king, but Jehoram isn't. He's evil, and he marries one of Ahab's daughters. So he, you know, this alliance that Jehoshaphat had with the north has shown his son a very bad example, because now his son marries one of Ahab's daughters. So now there's a bloodline between the south and the north. Very unhealthy. Now he begins his rule, this Jehoram, when he was 32, and he ruled for 8 years. All right. So what we've got is we've got Joram in the north and Jehoram in the south. They're not related to each other, but Joram in the north and Jehoram in the south. And it was while Jehoram was ruling in the south that Edom revolted against Judah in exactly the same way that Moab had revolted against the north. And of course the point is, when Israel was in fellowship with God, the surrounding nations bowed down to them. When Israel got out of fellowship with God, the surrounding nations broke away, got independence, and then became aggressive towards them. And now it's happening down in the south as well, because Judah's out of fellowship too. Now then, he dies. This is Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, in the south. He dies and is succeeded by his son Ahaziah, not to be confused with Ahab's oldest son, who ruled a few years earlier in the north, who died at the command of Elijah. This is where it gets complicated. So we've got another guy called Ahaziah. All right, he is Jehoram's son, and he is now ruling down in the south in Judah. Again, he was evil like his father, and of course what you've got now is that he is the son, because his father married Ahab's daughter. This guy is bloodline to Ahab. And the point is, it's not just that now the king was related by marriage to Ahab's family. The king was like Ahab and his family. And this is the problem. If you cohort with evil, the evil rubs off onto you. And he gets into an alliance with Joram in the north, all right, to have a war against Hazael, who's become the king in Aram, all right? So the point is that now, in the south, okay, the king, Ahaziah, now forms an alliance with Joram, the king in the north, Israel, so that they can have a war against Hazael, all right? Because Hazael has been attacking them, and now they want to go and get their own back and invade and destroy Aram, or Syria as it became known later. Now, whilst this happened, in this war, Joram, the king of Israel in the north, is wounded, all right? So he's wounded quite badly in that battle. Now then, in chapter 9, Elisha dispatches one of his prophets to Ramoth Gilead, which earlier they'd won back, all right, from Aram, to anoint a guy called Jehu, whose father was Jehoshaphat, but not the guy who was not the Jehoshaphat who was king in the south. Told you it was complicated, didn't I? To anoint Jehu up in the north, all right, as king over Israel, all right? So what's happening is that in the north at this point, okay, the king is Joram, all right, and he's in alliance with Ahaziah, the king of the south, Judah. They've had a battle against Aram, and Joram, the king of Israel in the north, has been wounded. Under Elisha's being led by the Spirit, a guy called Jehu is now anointed to be king in Jehu's place and to rule over Israel in Jehu's place. And the prophet, who's been sent by Elisha, instructs Jehu, and this had been revealed to Elijah years earlier as well, all right, back in 1 Kings, instructs Jehu that he was to utterly destroy Ahab's family. so that all Ahab's descendants are to be wiped out, including Jezebel, who was his wife, all right? Because remember now, Ahab's family, not only are they ruling in the north, but by marriage, Ahab's family have now wormed their way into the south as well. So what happens now, all right, Joram, okay, the king of Israel, and Ahaziah, the king of Judah in the south, all right, both of Ahab's household, all right, they're both related to Ahab. They're at Jezreel recovering from this battle that they've just had with Hazael, the king of Aram, all right, and we saw that Joram got wounded in there, okay. And Jehu takes an army to Jezreel, and Joram rides out to see what he wants. So, you know, he rides out, "What do you want, Jehu?" And Jehu shoots him. And probably says something like, "Does that answer your question?" Or, "Are you getting my point?" You know, something, but he shoots him with a bow and arrow. So bang, there goes Joram, all right. Ahaziah was wounded in the battle that followed, but escaped to Megiddo, place called Megiddo, and he died of his wounds there, and his body was taken back to Jerusalem. And having done that, so now, all right, Jehu has now killed the king in the south and the king in the north, because they were both related to Ahab's family, and he is under instructions from the Lord to kill the residue of Ahab's family, all right. Now Jehu goes after Jezebel, Ahab's wife. And you remember that when Elijah pronounced judgment against Ahab, he told him that Jezebel would be eaten by dogs and that there'd be nothing left of her to bury, all right? So now Ahab goes after Jezebel, and she's at Jezreel as well. And as he rides up, she's in her house and she's on the top floor, and she mocks him as he rides in. She knows that he's on the Lord's business, but she mocks him. And then what happens is that on Jehu's order, her eunuchs, i.e. her servants, her eunuchs throw her out of the window, and so she falls to her death. And her body lies in the streets, and the dogs eat her. And there's nothing left for anyone to bury, just as Elijah the prophet had prophesied years earlier. And so now Jehu pursues all of the rest of Ahab's remaining descendants and kills them all. And having done that, he now completely cleanses Israel of Baal worship. So he's now very much doing an Elijah, and he kills all the priests of Baal, and he rids the land of Baal worship. And he ruled, okay, over Israel for 28 years. And he followed the Lord, but the Bible says not fully. Not fully. He kept a little bit of idolatry going. He had a little bit of idolatry going on the side, but it wasn't Baal worship. So fundamentally he did what the Lord wanted him to do, but he ruled over Israel for 28 years and followed the Lord, but as I say, not fully. And so we've now got the situation, okay, where Jehu is the king in the north, and he's reasonably good. He's actually following the Lord. But down in the south, they're now, for the time being, without a king. And they're without a king because Ahaziah, who was the king of Judah, in sort of like alliance with Joram, he's been killed. And so you'll have to wait in absolute suspense to find out what happens in the south next, all right? And but at this point, the Lord begins to reduce the size of Israel. So up in the north, all right, we've moved away from the south now. Up in the north, what's happening is that Hazael, who's the king of Aram or Syria, what he's doing is he is encroaching more and more on the territory that Israel has. And more of Israel is coming under Syrian control. And the land in the north is shrinking.
Because the more out of fellowship Israel gets, the more of the land they lose. And bear in mind that the Lord had always said to them through Moses, and this was written into their law, that the ultimate judgment upon them as a nation, be it Israel or Judah, was that they would be taken out of the land completely and taken away into captivity. And we'll certainly see more pertaining to that next time. So what we've got, okay, is that Ahaziah, the king of Judah, he's been killed, all right? And so at the moment, you know, sort of like where we're going to end now, the south is without a king at the moment. Jehu has been ruling in Israel fairly well, but Israel's part of the land is shrinking because Syria, Aram, is encroaching more and more on their territory. And eventually what happens is that Jehu, who's been a reasonably good king, he dies, and his son takes over from him, and his son was called Jehoahaz. Now that's where we're going to leave it tonight. We're about halfway through 2 Kings now. We're going to leave it there. Next time, when we come on to do the rest of it, we'll start off with another recap that will quickly cover everything that we've done so far, because I know it's getting a bit complicated. There's no way for me to make this any easier, because this is the way that 1 and 2 Kings are written. I can't change the way that they're actually put together. But the point is, by taking it slowly now, I'm hoping that we'll be able to take more and more of it in, even though it is getting a bit complicated. So we're going to leave it there, but next time we will begin with a recap of everything that we've done so far to keep the continuity going. And in fact, next time we're going to see the history of Israel right up to the time, well, Israel and Judah, right up to the time when neither kingdom was left in the land, and both kingdoms, north and south, had been carted off into captivity. So where we're going to be by the end of next time's talk, the end of 2 Kings, is we'll have seen the history of Israel, the conquest of Canaan, coming into Canaan, taking it over in the time of Joshua, the 300 to 400 years of the time of Judges, all right, in the land, then the coming of kings, all right, so we've got Saul, David and Solomon, all right, and kind of like the golden era being at the beginning of the reign of Solomon. And then we'll have seen their entire history of Israel establishing themselves into the land, right through to the point where they get kicked out of it. So we'll have gone full circle. Having started, or in Joshua, with the conquest of Canaan, Israel taking the land over, next time we're going to see that 2 Kings ends with Israel, the Jews themselves, booted out of the land, because that is how much out of fellowship both nations eventually got. So we'll carry on with that next time with a big recap, and we'll just, as I say, take it slowly. And I know that this means that you're going to have to listen to these tapes a couple of times. I know that. But once you've got a rough idea, it will put you in very good stead. So difficult though it is at the moment, we will carry on next time.